Kelvin, where is the money? Where is it?
I am at work. What money do you mean?
The surgery money is gone. It was transferred to Prestige Motors.
My husband bought his side chick a car with the money for our son's surgery. The transfer alert came in at 6:43 in the morning, and by 6:43, Chinanza was on her knees on the cold tiles of her hospital room, not in prayer, but because her legs simply stopped holding her up. 2 days. Her son had 2 days before his heart surgery, a surgery that cost 4,300,000 naira, money she had watched grow for 11 months, kobo by kobo, inside a joint account she barely touched because she trusted the man who held the other card to it. She refreshed the banking app 3 times because the mind does that. It tries to blink an unbearable number into a different shape. The balance did not change. 11,420 naira. That was what remained of a fund built from her tailoring shop, from her mother's pension, from a GoFundMe her church women's group had shared until it went round the whole state, from a loan her brother had co-signed against his own chambers. She scrolled down to the transaction history with fingers that had gone strange and distant, like they belonged to somebody else. And there it was, dated 3 days earlier, a single line that would end a marriage before the sun finished rising. 4,100,000 naira, transferred to Prestige Motors Limited. If you are new to this channel, welcome. And if stories like this keep you at night wondering what you would have done in her place, subscribe now, because what Chinanza found at that dealership 3 hours later was not the end of her nightmare. It was only the door into it. She did not call Kelvin first. She called the bank. A calm customer service voice told her what the screen had already screamed at her, that the transfer was authorized from the registered device, verified with a PIN, no dispute possible without a police report. She sat on the edge of her son's hospital bed, watching his small chest rise and fall under a blue blanket printed with cartoon giraffes, an oxygen line taped gently beneath his nose. And she made herself breathe the way he was breathing, slow, counted, because if she let herself feel what was underneath, she would scream and wake him. Kamsi was 6 years old. He had a hole in his heart the doctors called a ventricular septal defect, a phrase Chinanza had learned to say without stumbling only in the last 2 months, the way you learn any language when your child's life depends on fluency in it. The surgery had been scheduled for Thursday. It was Tuesday, and the money that was supposed to keep her son alive had gone to buy something else entirely. She left the ward quietly, kissed her son's forehead, told the nurse she would be back by lunch, and stood in the stairwell for a full minute before she could make her thumb press call. Because some part of her, some stubborn, hopeful part that had survived 9 years of marriage on exactly this kind of stubbornness, still wanted there to be an explanation. A bank error, a mistaken transfer she could reverse with one phone call and a signature. She wanted, more than anything in that moment, to be wrong. She dialed her husband with hands that would not stop shaking. Kelvin, where is the money? What money, Chi? I'm at work. The surgery money, it's gone. 4,100,000, transferred to somewhere called Prestige Motors. There was a silence on the line that told her everything before he said a single word. The kind of silence a guilty man makes when he is deciding which lie is cheapest. Someone hacked the account, Kelvin said. I already reported it to the bank's fraud line this morning. For a flickering second, Chinanza let herself believe it, because the alternative was too large to hold standing up. Which fraud line? Give me the reference number, Kelvin. I'll call them myself right now. I don't have it with me. It's at the office. I'll send it when I... Send it now. The silence stretched again, longer this time, and somewhere inside it Chinanza heard the lie collapsing under its own weight, heard her husband's breathing change on the other end of the line, quick and shallow, a man realizing the story he'd built in the space of one phone call would not survive contact with a woman who had spent 11 months tracking every kobo of that account like it was oxygen. "I can explain," he said at last, his voice dropping the performance. "It's not what you think." But it was exactly what she thought, and by the time she hung up, she already knew. The way a woman knows things her mind has not yet allowed her mouth to say out loud. On the drive to the dealership, she passed very hospital gate she had left through minutes earlier, and for a moment she almost turned the car around, almost told herself she was being dramatic, that a wife who abandons her sick child's bedside to chase down a suspicion is a wife who has lost perspective. But the transaction record sat open on the phone in the passenger seat the whole drive. 4,100,000 naira. Prestige Motors Limited. And no amount of talking herself down could make those words mean anything gentler than what they said. She thought of the woman she used to be before Kamsi's diagnosis, the woman who trusted easily, who let Kelvin manage the bigger financial decisions because he was better with numbers, who signed the joint account paperwork without reading every line because that was what love looked like she had believed then, a shared name on a shared future. That woman felt like a stranger to her now, someone she had outgrown in the space of a single phone call. Chinanza had married Kelvin 9 years ago in a small blue and white wedding in Owerri that her father had paid for because Kelvin's own family could not, and she had never once let that fact sit as a weight between them, not when he lost his logistics job during the pandemic, not when she took over as the one who paid rent for 11 straight months, not when he started coming home smelling of perfume that was not hers, and she told herself it was probably from the crowded boss, from someone standing too close, because a marriage is built partly out of the lies we agree to believe about the people we love. Her brother in Kenya, a lawyer with an office on Douglas Road, had never liked Kelvin, not from the first dinner, and he had said so plainly at her introduction ceremony, while their mother pinched his arm to shut him up. That one has soft hands and a hungry mouth, Kenya told her once, years ago, over pepper soup she barely touched. Men like that will spend your peace before they spend your money. She had laughed it off then. She was not laughing now. She drove to Prestige Motors with her heart doing something violent in her chest, past the security gate, past a row of gleaming SUVs under a corrugated awning, and there, standing beside a wine-red Toyota Camry with a bow of gold ribbon still taped to its hood like a birthday gift, was her husband, and beside him, laughing at something on her phone screen, was a woman Chinanza had never seen in her life. The woman was young, maybe 26, in a fitted Ankara dress and braids that fell past her shoulders, and she was holding car keys like a person holds something they have wanted for a long time and finally been given. Kelvin's face, when he turned and saw his wife standing there in her nurse's visitor slippers with her hospital watch band still on her arm from where she'd been sleeping beside her son's bed, did not go pale. It went blank. That blankness frightened Chinanza more than guilt would have, because guilt at least admits there was a line that got crossed. Blankness meant he had already decided, somewhere inside himself, that this was allowed. "Chi," he said, "let me explain." "Explain what?" Chinanza said, and her own voice came out strange to her, flat and low, not the voice she recognized as her own. "Explain why our son's surgery money bought this woman a car." The woman, her name Chinanza would learn within an hour, was Tamara, stepped back with the key still in her fist, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to find a version of the truth she could survive saying out loud. "He told me it was his money," Tamara said. "He told me business was good. He said he wanted to appreciate me." "Appreciate you," Chinanza repeated, and something in her chest that had been holding steady for 6 months, through diagnosis, through fundraising, through nights sleeping upright in a plastic hospital chair, simply gave way. And she was screaming before she meant to say it, screaming in a car showroom with fluorescent light and a salesman frozen mid-step with a clipboard, screaming the way you scream when the floor of your life has been quietly removed for weeks and you are only now falling through it. Because here's what makes a betrayal like this different from an ordinary affair, different from a marriage that simply dies or neglect. This was not a man who found comfort in another woman while his family struggled around him.
Was a man who reached directly into the account meant to save his own son's life and spent it on someone else's happiness, and did so with a calm enough hand to buy a bow for the hood. Kelvin tried to touch her shoulder. She stepped back so fast she nearly fell over a display stand of car air fresheners. "Don't," she said. "Don't you dare touch me." The salesman, a young man in a too-tight company polo, had drifted toward the back office by now, clearly deciding this was not a transaction he wanted his name attached to. Tamara stood frozen between them, the car keys still hanging from her fingers, her eyes moving between husband and wife, like she was watching two versions of a man she thought she knew collide in real time and cancel each other out. "Kelvin," she said quietly, "you told me your wife knew. You told me she agreed to sell the old car and use the money to help us start something. You said—" "Tamara, not now," Kelvin snapped, and something in the sharpness of it, the way he turned on the woman he had supposedly bought a car to appreciate, told Chinanza more about her husband's character than 9 years of marriage had managed to. If this were his story with an easy villain, Kelvin would have run at that moment, would have driven off with his side chick and left Chinanza standing in that showroom to piece herself together alone. But he did not run. He stayed, and what he said next was almost more disorienting than the theft itself. "I was going to put it back," he said. "I have a deal closing Friday. I was going to pay it back before you even needed the money for the surgery." Chinanza stared at him. "The surgery is Thursday." For the first time, something like real fear crossed his face. Not fear of losing her, she would understand much later, but fear of consequences, the particular fear of a man who has always believed his charm would outrun his choices. She left the dealership without another word, drove 3 streets before she had to pull over because her hands would not hold the wheel steady, and sat there with the engine running, staring at nothing, doing the arithmetic of a mother whose son needs a heart repaired in 48 hours and has 11,000 naira to do it with. She called her brother. Ikenna picked up on the second ring, still in his court robes. She could hear the rustle of paper and the low murmur of his chambers behind him. "Chi, what's wrong? Your voice." She told him everything. The transfer, the dealership, the ribbon on the car, Tamara's face when she realized whose money had bought her joy. There was a long pause on the line, and when Ikenna spoke again, his voice had dropped into a register she had heard him use only once before, the year their father died and he had to be the one to identify the body. "Where is Kamsi's surgery scheduled?" he asked. "Thursday, 2 days. "Okay," Ikenna said. "Okay. I am coming to the hospital. Do not sign anything. Do not agree to any payment plan. Do not let Kelvin near that account again. I will handle this." Do you think a brother's promise like that is enough to save a 6-year-old boy's surgery in 48 hours? Stay with me, because what Ikenna did next would split this family in half in a way none of them saw coming. And if you want to see how far a family can fracture before it either breaks completely or finds something stronger underneath the wreckage, subscribe, because we are only getting started. Ikenna arrived at the hospital within an hour, still in his black robes, his white bands slightly crooked from having removed them and put them back on in the car. He found Chinanza in the corridor outside Kamsi's room, sitting on a plastic bench with her face in her hands, and when she looked up at him, he saw something in his sister's eyes that he had not seen since their father's funeral, a kind of exhausted, bottomless grief that had nowhere left to go. "How much do we need by Thursday?" he asked, sitting beside her, his voice gentler now than it had been on the phone. 4,100,000 naira. All of it. Ikenna exhaled slowly through his nose.
He had co-signed the original loan for the fund, he told her, precisely because he did not fully trust Kelvin with that kind of money sitting untouched for months. And thank God, because it meant he still had standing to move quickly. He would call in every favor he had. He would talk to the hospital administrator, a man he had represented years earlier in a land dispute, and ask for 48 hours of grace on partial payment while they raised the difference. He would talk to their church. He would talk to the GoFundMe organizer and ask her to reopen it with the true story attached, because sympathy, cruel as it was to admit, moves faster than logic. And a story like this one, a father who stole his dying son's surgery money for a mistress's car, would spread across Owerri and beyond it before nightfall. But there was something else Ikenna needed to say, and he said it carefully, watching his sister's face the whole time. Chi, I am also going to report this to the police. Chinanza's head came up sharply. Ikenna, no. If Kelvin goes to prison, who helps me raise Kamsi? Who? Ikenna, his voice was firm now, the courtroom voice, the voice that did not bend. This is not a marital dispute. This is theft. This is fraud. He took money that was never his alone to take, money entrusted to a joint account for a specific, documented, life or death purpose, and he used it for personal gratification for a woman who is not his wife. If we do not report this formally, we lose two things. We lose any legal leverage to recover funds from the dealership because a police report is the fastest route to freezing that vehicle and possibly reversing part of the transaction. And we lose the only leverage strong enough to make Kelvin's family come up with money out of shame and fear faster than they would ever out of love. Chinanza sat with that for a long moment, staring at the closed door of her son's room, at the small laminated sign taped beside it that read, Pediatric Cardiac Unit, quiet please. He's still Kamsi's father, she whispered, and Kamsi still needs a heart surgeon on Thursday, Ikenna said. Those two facts do not cancel each other out, but right now, only one of them can be your priority. She nodded once, and something inside her closed like a door being locked from the outside, not out of anger exactly, though there was plenty of that, but out of the terrible clarity that comes to a mother when she finally understands that mercy and survival are in this moment two different roads and she can only walk one of them. By that evening, Ikenna had filed the report himself, using his own name as the complainant alongside Chinanza's, both to expedite it through a colleague at the State Police Fraud Unit and, though he did not say this part out loud to his sister, to make absolutely certain that no one, not Kelvin's family, not the officers who might otherwise be persuaded with a modest bribe, could quietly make the case disappear. He knew how these things worked in Nigeria, how many stolen fortunes had evaporated into family matters, and we have settled it at home the moment money changed hands in a back office. Not this time, not with his sister's son's life on the table. Before the arrest itself, there was a night neither Chinanza nor Ikenna had expected, a night when Kelvin showed up at their mother's gate unannounced, banging on the metal until a neighbor threatened to call security. Chinanza did not let him in. She stood at the window of her old childhood bedroom, watching him through the gap in the curtain, and listened to him shout apologies into the dark that sounded, even from a distance, more like negotiations than remorse. Chi, please, I'll get the money back. Give me till Friday. Please don't do this to me. Think about what a court case will do to Kamsi's name when he's older. It was the last part that nearly broke her, the casual cruelty of a man invoking his own son's future welfare as a bargaining chip, while that same son lay in a hospital bed made possible only by money Kelvin himself had stolen. Ikenna came out to the gate instead, calm in a way that unsettled Kelvin more than shouting would have. Go home, Kelvin. Whatever you say to her through that gate tonight, I will hear about it tomorrow and I will use it. Kelvin left, but not before delivering one final line that Chinanza would replay in her mind for weeks afterwards, a line that sounded in the moment like a threat, though later, in the cold light of the courtroom, it would sound more like a confession. You don't understand what kind of trouble I am actually in. The car isn't even the real problem. Neither Chinanza nor Ikenna understood what he meant by that until much later, and when they finally did, it would reframe everything that came before it. Kelvin was arrested the next morning at his workplace in front of colleagues who would talk about it in hushed voices for months afterwards. Two officers walking him out past the reception desk while he protested that this was a misunderstanding, that his wife would drop the charges, that his brother-in-law was overreacting. He was wrong on every count. News like that doesn't stay contained. By the time Chinanza sat in the pre-operative waiting area on Thursday morning, her phone had exploded with messages, some from relatives asking if it was true, some from strangers who had seen the reshared fundraiser with its new brutal headline, "Father steals son's surgery fund to buy mistress a car, son now fighting for his life." Some from Kelvin's own mother calling to beg her not to press further charges, to think of the family name, to think of Kamsi growing up with his father in prison. Chinanza let most of those calls ring out. She was sitting 3 feet from a glass window that looked into the corridor, where in a few hours her son would be wheeled toward a surgical theater, and she found she had exactly one reservoir of feeling left in her, and she was saving every drop for him. The fundraiser, reopened with Ikena's carefully worded update, did what Ikena predicted. It moved fast, faster than either of them expected. Within 18 hours, it had raised 1,800,000 naira from strangers moved by outrage as much as sympathy, moved by the particular fury a story like this ignites in people who have loved and been betrayed themselves. Their church, ashamed and stricken, took up 2 emergency offerings in a single week and handed Chinanza an envelope containing 600,000 naira, more than she had ever seen her congregation raise for anything. And Kelvin's family, cornered by the arrest, by the headlines, by the shame of a name now attached to a fraud case, produced, almost magically, 1 million naira they had claimed for months did not exist. The same family who had told Chinanza 8 months earlier that they simply had nothing to contribute toward their grandson's surgery. Not every message that landed in Chinanza's inbox that week was kind. Some strangers, emboldened by the anonymity of a share button, accused her of exaggerating her son's condition for sympathy, of staying with a man capable of this for 9 years, and therefore bearing some blame for what he became. She read 3 of those
messages before Ikena took the phone gently from her hand and told her she was done reading comments for the week, that her only job now was to sit beside her son and let other people carry the noise for her. It was a small mercy, but in a week built almost entirely out of cruelty, small mercies were the only currency that mattered. Kelvin's mother called Chinanza twice more before Thursday, her voice cracking in a way that might have moved Chinanza in an earlier version of her life, begging her to withdraw the police report, insisting that family matters belonged inside the family and not in front of a magistrate. "You would destroy this boy's father," the older woman said, "and one day he will ask you why you did it." Chinanza, standing in the hospital corridor with her son's heartbeat visible on a monitor through a half-open door, found she had no patience left for that particular argument. "I am not destroying his father," she told her mother-in-law quietly. "His father destroyed himself the day he chose a car over his son's heart. I am simply the one who is still standing here to answer for it." She ended the call and did not pick up again when the number rang a 3rd time. It still was not enough. Ikena sat with the hospital administrator for 2 hours on Wednesday night, negotiating a payment structure that would let the surgery proceed on schedule, with the balance financed against Kelvin's seized assets, pending the outcome of the fraud case. A legal maneuver that made the administrator visibly uncomfortable, but that Ikena, with the particular relentlessness of a man protecting his own blood, would not let him refuse. By Thursday morning, they had enough. Not comfortably enough, just enough. The way a family scrapes together exactly enough and no more. The way survival so often looks from the inside. Chinanza sat beside her son's gurney
as the anesthesiologist explained the process one more time, and Kamsi, small and brave, in a hospital gown 3 sizes too big, reached up and touched her face. "Mommy, why are you crying?" "I'm not crying, baby. My eyes are just tired." "Is Daddy coming?" And there it was. The question Chinanza had been dreading since the moment she found that transaction on her banking app. The question a 6-year-old boy asks with no understanding of fraud, of mistresses, of arrest warrants, only the simple, unbearable logic of a child who wants both his parents in the room when he's afraid. "Daddy can't come today, baby," she said, and her voice held, somehow held steady in a way she would later not understand how she managed. "But I am here. I'm not going anywhere." If you have ever had to lie to protect a child from a truth too large for them to carry, you already know the particular ache in Chinanza's chest in that moment. And if this story has you holding your breath, don't go anywhere, because what happens after Kamsi is wheeled into that operating room will change how you see every person in this story, including the one you think you already understand completely. Subscribe now, because the next part is where the real twist begins. The surgery took 6 hours and 11 minutes. Chinanza spent every one of them in the waiting room, sometimes sitting, sometimes pacing a worn path along the linoleum floor, sometimes standing at the window watching rain begin to fall over the hospital parking lot, thin and grey and steady, the kind of rain that seems to fall for no one in particular. Ikenna sat with her for most of it, sometimes stepping out to take calls from his colleague at the fraud unit, his face unreadable each time he returned, until finally, around hour 4, he sat down beside her and told her what she needed to know. Kelvin had been formally charged. Obtaining property by false possessions, misappropriation of jointly held funds, and, because the amount exceeded a certain threshold, a charge that under Nigerian law could carry a sentence of years, not months, if convicted. He had been denied bail at his first appearance, the magistrate citing flight risk given the size of the sum and the involvement of a lawyer as complainant, which meant, practically speaking, that Kelvin would spend at least the coming weeks in custody while the case built, unable even to attend his own son's recovery. Chinanza absorbed this news the way a person absorbs weather, without much reaction left to give it, because there was only room in her for one outcome right now, and it was happening behind a set of double doors 40 feet away. But here is the detail that would come out later, weeks later, in a conversation between Chinanza and Tamara that neither of them expected to have. And it is the detail that turns this story from a simple tale of a cruel husband into something far more complicated, something that made even Ikenna, hardened by 15 years of legal practice, go quiet when he heard it. Tamara had not known about the surgery. She had not known about Kamsi's condition at all. Kelvin had told her he was a successful logistics consultant between contracts, that the money for the car was a bonus from a shipment deal, that his marriage was already effectively over, a technicality he was working through the courts to dissolve. She believed him, not because she was naive, but because he had been telling a version of that lie for 4 months, building it carefully, the way a man builds a second life out of the spare hours and the spare truths he steals from his first one. When the story broke, when her name appeared in comment sections and screenshots circulated with her face tagged beside words like home wrecker and accomplice, Tamara went to the police herself, unprompted, and returned the car. She tracked down Chinanza's number through a mutual acquaintance and called her 3 weeks after the surgery, her voice shaking so badly Chinanza almost hung up before she understood who it was. "I didn't know," Tamara said. "I swear before God, I did not know there was a sick child. He told me you two were separated. He told me the money was his own. I would never. I have a nephew with sickle cell anemia. I know what it means to fight for a child's life. I would never have taken a single naira of that money if I had known." Chinanza sat with the phone against her ear for a long time before she answered, because rage is a simpler thing to hold than the truth that the woman on the other end of the line was also in her own way used as a tool in her husband's deception, handed a stolen gift wrapped in a lie so complete that even the person turning the ribbon had no idea what it cost. "I believe you," Chinanza finally said, and she found to her own surprise that she meant it. "But I need you to understand something. It doesn't change anything for me. It doesn't bring back 6 months of sleepless nights or the fear I carried into that operating room. You not knowing doesn't undo what happened to my son." "I know," Tamara said. "I'm not calling to ask you to forgive me. I'm calling because I gave the car back and I gave the dealership everything I had toward the balance he still owed on it. And I wanted you to know that whatever comes back from that, it should go to Kamsi, not to me. I don't want any part of that money touching me again." It was, Chinanza would say later, the single strangest and most humanizing moment inside a story that had otherwise stripped every person in it down to their worst impulses. A reminder that betrayal rarely travels in a straight line, that it fans outward and catches people who never asked to be standing in its path. Kamsi came out of surgery stable. The repair had gone as well as the surgeons could have hoped. The hole closed, the small overworked heart finally given the chance to beat the way it was always meant to. Chinanza was allowed in to see him in recovery 2 hours later, and she stood over his bed watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, no longer shallow and effortful the way it had been for months, and she cried in a way she had not let herself cry through the entire ordeal. Not from grief this time, but from the strange, disorienting relief of a fear finally released. The lead surgeon, a soft-spoken man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, found her still standing there an hour later and told her in the plain clinical language doctors use to soften enormous news that barring complications, Kamsi could expect a completely ordinary life, sport included, a full childhood ahead of him with nothing but a thin scar to mark what he had survived. Chinanza thanked him 3 times before he left, and then she sat down in the chair beside her son's bed and did not move for a long while, simply watching him breathe, memorizing the sound of it the way she had memorized the sound of his labored, effortful breaths, as though her attention alone could keep his heart beating. She thought, sitting there, that this should have been the end of the story. The surgery had succeeded. Her son would live. Wasn't that enough to close the wound?
It was not. And if you think a happy ending is coming easily after everything Chinanza survived, stay close. Because the final piece of this story is the one that changed how she saw her marriage, her husband, and herself. And it arrived in a courtroom 4 months later in a way nobody in that family expected. The trial moved slowly, the way these things do, in a system stretched thin across too many cases and too few judges. And in the month between Kelvin's arrest and his day in court, Chinanza rebuilt a life around the absence of him with a kind of grim, practical efficiency. She moved back into her mother's house with Kamsi, partly because to save money, partly because she could not bear to sleep in the bed she had shared with a man who had looked at their son's medical file and calculated, apparently, that a car meant more. She expanded her tailoring business, taking on 2 apprentices, because word had spread of her story in ways that brought both pity and, strangely, an uptick in customers. Women who wanted to support her directly, who ordered dresses they did not entirely need because they had read her story online and felt in some small transactional way like they were standing beside her. Ikenna visited every week, sometimes with case updates, sometimes just to sit with Kamsi and let the boy climb on him and demand piggyback rides around the compound. And slowly, the family that had nearly come apart in the space of 48 hours found a new shape, smaller, quieter, but sturdier than the one it had replaced. It was during discovery, 3 months into the case, that Ikenna finally understood what Kelvin had meant that night at the gate, the line that had sat in Chinanza's chest like a splinter for weeks. The car had not been an isolated act of selfishness. Kelvin had been quietly siphoning small amounts from a logistics client's escrow account at his workplace for nearly a year, a slower, more careful theft than the one that finally caught up with him. And the surgery fund transfer had been in part a desperate attempt to cover a shortfall his employer's auditors were already circling before Chinanza ever noticed her own account was empty. The car had been a symptom, not the disease. Kelvin was not simply a man who fell for a younger woman and made one catastrophic decision under the fog of infatuation. He was a man who had been quietly bleeding money out of every account he could reach for a long time, and his son's surgery fund had simply been the largest, most accessible wound left to open. When this came out in court, Chinanza sat very still in her seat, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost merciful, that she had not lost a good man to one weak moment. She had been married, for years, to someone she had never fully known at all. Kelvin, for his part, had not stopped fighting. He hired a lawyer of his own, argued through counsel that the funds had been intended as a temporary personal loan against future earnings, that his wife's failure to monitor the joint account constituted a degree of shared negligence, an argument so audacious that even the presiding judge, according to Ikenna, had paused mid-hearing to ask counsel to repeat himself, as if she could not quite believe what she had heard. On the day of sentencing, Chinanza sat in the third row of the courtroom with her mother beside her, Kamsi at home with an aunt, because some things a 7-year-old, freshly recovering, freshly alive, should not have to watch. Kelvin stood when the judge asked him to, thinner than she remembered, his shirt hanging looser on his frame. And for one strange moment, their eyes met across the room, and Chinanza waited to feel something enormous, hatred, grief, some final closing emotion that would tell her the story was over. What she felt instead was almost nothing at all, a kind of quiet, hollowed-out clarity, the way a room feels after a storm has passed through it and taken the furniture with it, leaving only the bare walls behind. When the prosecutor read the full weight of the evidence into the record, the escrow shortfall alongside the surgery fund, Chinanza watched Kelvin's shoulders drop lower with every sentence, and she understood, in a way that felt less like triumph and more like exhaustion, that whatever version of her husband she had married 9 years earlier probably never fully existed at all, that she had spent nearly a decade loving a performance rather than a person, and the performance had finally, publicly, run out of road. Kelvin was sentenced to 4 years, with the possibility of reduced time for restitution, ordering him to repay what remained of the stolen sum from any future earnings garnished directly for as long as it took. It was not everything Chinanza might have once wanted in the private, furious hours of that first night in the showroom when she had screamed loud enough to freeze a salesman mid-step. It was not nothing either. Outside the courthouse, Ikenna put a hand on her shoulder, the same gesture their father used to make, and asked her if she was all right. "I don't know what all right means anymore," Chinanza said honestly, "but Kamsi is alive. He runs across the compound now like nothing ever happened to his heart. He doesn't remember most of it, the doctors say children that age rarely do, and some days I think that's the only mercy this whole thing gave any of us, that the person who suffered the most has already started to forget." Her tailoring business, in the strange arithmetic of grief and public attention, grew into something she had never planned for. A woman who had watched the story unfold on social media, a boutique owner in Port Harcourt, reached out to ask if Chinanza would supply a small line of children's churchwear, and within a year, she had 2 apprentices under her, then 4, then a small shop front with her own name stitched above the door in gold thread, a detail Kamsi liked to trace with his finger every time they walked past it. She never once described what happened to her as a blessing in disguise, a phrase she came to despise in the mouths of people who had not sat where she sat, but she did allow herself, on quieter evenings, to notice that the woman rebuilding a business from a hospital corridor bench had somehow become steadier than the woman who had once handed over every financial decision to a husband because it was easier to ask questions. She did not remarry. Not in the 2 years that followed, not because she had closed herself off to love, but because she had learned in the most brutal way a woman can learn it, exactly how much trust costs when it is spent on the wrong person, and she was in no hurry to spend it again cheaply.
Tamara, strangely, remained a distant presence in her life. Not a friend exactly, but something adjacent to one. An occasional message checking on Kamsi's health, a small anonymous contribution to his school fees the following year that Chinanza only later learned the source of and chose to, after everything, not to refuse. If there is a lesson sitting inside a story like this one, it is not the tidy kind you can print on a wall calendar. It is something closer to what Chinanza herself said, months later, to a women's group at her church, when a younger wife asked her how she had survived it, how she had kept from breaking entirely. I didn't survive it by being strong, she told them. I survived it because when everything I trusted collapsed in the same 48 hours, I still had one person left who chose me before I even had to ask him to. And I learned that the people who show up when there's nothing left to gain from showing up are the only inheritance worth protecting. Kamsi is 9 years old now, and he plays football on Saturdays in a scar he no longer notices tracing faintly down the center of his chest. And some evenings, watching him run, Chinanza still finds herself glancing toward the gate, half expecting, out of 9 years of old habit, to see a car pull in that never arrives anymore, and she has stopped waiting for it to. If Chinanza's story moved you tonight, don't scroll past without hitting subscribe, because stories like hers, the ones about what people do when love and money and desperation collide, are the ones we tell every week on this channel. And somewhere out there is a story waiting for you that will hit even closer to home than this one did.